Welcome back to the Derek and Isaac 1 at 100 podcast. This is part 34 of a 782-part series on the entire history of the world. Today we will be discussing the Second Industrial Revolution. I'm your host, Derek Hosky, and I'm accompanied by my co-host, Mr. Isaac J.
It's great to be here, as always. Love talking about the world with you, Derek.
That's good to hear. And later in this podcast, we'll have our guest, the Honorable Mitchell Cohen. Now, Isaac, do you want to go ahead and give us the rundown of what we're talking about today?
All right, so basically today we're going to be talking about advancements in new industries, specifically steel, chemicals, and electricity, which led to new possibilities of production, and we're going to be discussing the steps that the newly created state of Germany used to become the industrial rival of Great Britain, and how it helped promote industry within its borders. And we're also going to be discussing how advancements in transportation and communication affected trade, migration, and global interactions. We're going to be discussing the hazards of industrial life, including pollution, overcrowding, poor working conditions, and child labor, and how did this impact life at the time. And we're also going to be talking about reactions to industrialization, including women's suffrage, public education, labor movements. We're going to be comparing capitalism and socialism. And finally, we're going to be discussing the ways that industrialization impacted imperialism in the 19th century. So today, as far as our first topic goes, we'll be talking about advancements in new industries, including, or specifically, steel, chemicals, and electricity, which led to new possibilities of production. So as far as steel goes, it all really started out when Henry Bessemer created a more efficient way of processing steel in 1856, which was way stronger than the traditionally used iron metal of the time. And while it wasn't without its flaws, it was a much better way of processing steel, and it was eventually replaced by the open hearth process, which was a much better and more efficient way of processing steel. And it was used for construction products because it was much stronger than iron. It was used for industrial machines. It's also used for railroads and ships, it was made possible by steel to build railroads at competitive prices, leading to improvements in transportation. As far as electricity goes, it replaced candles and gas lamps, and it also replaced steam as the main power source. The first efficient commercial generators came about in the 1870s, and in 1881, Britain built the first public power station, and in 1910, it became possible to power a residential area from one single power station. It also led to the creation of the telephone by Alexander Graham Bell in 1876, and Thomas Edison and Joseph Swan perfected the design of the light bulb in 1879, in which they created the first economically efficient and safe light bulb. By replacing steam engines, they can make vast improvements in production efficiency. However, the switch to electricity in production was slow, but the use of electricity first began to dominate in many industries during the Second Industrial Revolution in the 1870s. As far as chemicals go, synthetic dyes were very important to the Second Industrial Revolution, as it created huge improvements in textile production. Also, the production process of dynamite was discovered, and it led to massive improvements in coal and construction industries. There are other chemicals that were used to help people's everyday lives as well. So then for our second topic, we decided to discuss the steps that the newly created state of Germany used to become the industrial rival of Great Britain, and how it helped promote industry within its own borders. So Germany first became officially united in 1871 by Otto von Bismarck, and there were many steps that they used after this unification to become the rival of Great Britain's industrialization. Germany imposed new high tariffs against imports and protected local industries and allowed them to flourish. The government also gave subsidies to businesses. The German state also heavily invested in education. It invested heavily in technical schools, which produced great minds and inventors. And eventually, by the time of the Second Industrial Revolution, Germany had a huge supply of talented and skilled workers, which really helped promote industry during this Second Industrial Revolution in Germany. So, Derek?
Yeah, so when we're looking at advancements in transportation, communication, and how that affected trade, migrations, and global interactions, we first need to look at one of the major inventions that kind of was a leading factor towards the Industrial Revolution, and that was the steam engine. So what this essentially created was steam-powered locomotives and steam-powered boats. Now, as far as locomotives or trains, these led to people being able to migrate across land a lot easier and quicker, and goods could also be transported quicker and for less of a price, which encouraged more trade across land. Now, in addition, with boats, not only did this create a great militaristic advantage with industrialized nations being able to sail to different areas with better speed and protection and firepower, but people could also migrate across the sea, as we see in some of our migration movements, and could also trade across the oceans in an easier, faster, and cheaper way. Now, another important innovation as far as communication goes was the creation of the telegraph by Samuel Morse. So what the telegraph was it used a new language system, Morse code, to communicate instantaneously, which basically made letters no longer necessary, and people could communicate all across the world a lot quicker. So we have our first primary document here, which should be put up on the screen now. And what this document basically is the first telegraph message ever sent. And this message essentially says, "What hath God wrought?" And this was sent from the Supreme Court room in the U.S. Capitol in Washington to Morse's assistant, Alfred Vail, in Baltimore. Now, when looking specifically at the Second Industrial Revolution, we can see the invention of the telephone by Alexander Graham Bell, which allowed for people to hold conversations from great distances away. And this had several lasting effects and is still technology that we use today, as it's very important with communication and information. Additionally, the canal system, or the improvement of the canal system, allowed for the transportation of goods by boat in the interior of countries to be possible, which was very important for trade. When seeing the hazards of industrial life, we can see factories, most importantly, created pollution, which pollution weakened the environment greatly, and it also led to very unsafe living conditions, which resulted in many deaths and injuries. In addition, child labor was beginning to be more employed in factories, which was very poor ethically, as kids were not treated properly, received low wages, and lived in very poor health conditions. In addition, industrialization led to overcrowding, where people would be living in tenements, where there would be very, very little room for a lot of people crammed into a very small space. And illnesses such as cholera were able to spread very quickly as well, which led to many deaths, especially in the overcrowded regions.
So next we're going to be talking about reactions to industrialization, including women's suffrage, public education, and labor movements. So as far as women's suffrage goes, more women were employed during the Industrial Revolution. About 1/3 of women were working outside of their homes, which is very uncommon, because in previous years, almost all women worked within the home or out in the fields. They also played a much bigger role in society. 57% of women 57% of people in factories were actually women, and women received much less pay. As a result, women wanted more educational, economic, and political opportunities. Women wanted the right to vote, and this movement was called the suffrage movement. The National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies was created in 1897. It was created and led by Millicent Fawcett. And then, as far as public education goes, public education became more accessible to poor masses. In 1833, the government passed the Factory Act, making 2 hours of education a day compulsory for children working in factories. The government also guaranteed money to charities for schools for the first time. In 1844, the Ragged Schools Union was set up to give schooling to very poor children. The Public Schools Act of 1868 reformed Britain's public schools, such as Eton and Harrow. In 1870, the Foster Act set up state-funded board schools for primary education. In 1880, the Education Act made school attendance compulsory for children up to the age of 10. And lastly, in 1902, the Education Act established a new system of secondary schools. So, for labor movements, we're going to have our guest speaker.
It sounds like he's already here. So,
all right, let's
Mitchell,
get on in.
Mitchell, we're going to turn this over to you. So, as far as labor movements, just tell us your thoughts.
Labor movements first formed because working conditions were horrible in most industries at the time. In the early part of the Industrial Revolution, most of the unions were smaller and local to a town or a state. After the Civil War, national unions began to form. One of the first national unions was the Knights of Labor in 1880. It grew rapidly, but just as quickly collapsed. The next major union to form was the American Federation of Labor, sometimes called the AFL. The AFL was founded in 1886 by Samuel Gompers. It became a powerful force in fighting for workers' rights through strikes and through politics. There were several major strikes that took place during the Industrial Revolution. One of them was the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. It began in Martinsburg, West Virginia, after the B&O Railroad Company cut wages for the third time in 1 year. The strike quickly spread throughout the country. When strikers tried to stop the trains from running, federal troops were sent in to put down the strike. Things turned violent and several strikers were killed. The strike ended fully 5 days after it started. Although the wages weren't restored, workers began to see the power they had through the strike. Other famous strikes included the Homestead Steel Mill Strike of 1892 and the Pullman Strike of 1894. Many of these strikes ended in violence and the destruction of property, but eventually, they began to have an impact on the workplace and conditions gradually improved.
Moving on to capitalism and socialism. Well, first I guess I should give a broad definition of what these each were. So, capitalism is essentially a free market system where the government doesn't necessarily control businesses. Businesses are privately owned. Whereas with socialism, the government does control everything, and that includes businesses, the prices of objects, how much people can make, what can be traded or purchased, and more. So, capitalism was essentially created by Adam Smith, and can be considered an economic democracy. It's based on businesses being created to help people in need of a certain product or a good or a service. Whereas with socialism, it was created by Karl Marx, and the system really doesn't work. Countries can't prosper with an entirely socialist system. And in order to create the government benefits of a socialist country, higher taxes are required, and that really just holds back the economy and doesn't allow for businesses or the clients of said businesses to get what they want. Socialism can be considered the economic dictatorship of the elite. So when we look at what systems work today, several years, hundreds of years after the Industrial Revolution, we see capitalism is really the only viable option, with many socialist countries and nations collapsing or dropping down dramatically in the social status of the world. But as far as what this did for America, and as far as the Industrial Revolution, it greatly improved the economy, and it led to a free market that has prospered ever since. Now on to the ways that that industrialization impacted imperialism in the 19th century. So, industrialization was essentially the motive and means of imperialism. Industrializing nations push economic integration on developing nations and would then extract value from said nations. Another example is with India, which was under control of Britain. When it was under the control of Britain, industrialized, and we saw Britain bring a whole railroad system that connected all of India and greatly industrialized the nation, but was all essentially created through imperialism.
So, do we have anything else to talk about today, Derek?
I think that about wraps up all of our main points. All right, have a good one.
See you guys next time.